Amanda had drawn a single black line through his name with such force that the ink bled through to the next page of the guest ledger. She didn't know that the man whose name she'd just erased was already standing in the shadow of the eastern corridor, watching her do it. She didn't know that no one had ever crossed out the name of the Alpha King and lived to host their event. And she certainly didn't know that by the end of this night, she'd be the reason he stayed. The grand hall of Thornwall Keep was alive with golden candlelight. Thousands of flames flickered from iron chandeliers that hung like crowns from the vaulted stone ceiling, casting long amber shadows across the polished marble floor. Amanda stood at the entrance podium in her deep amethyst gown, the velvet catching the light every time she shifted. The fabric was fitted through the bodice and swept to the floor in a cascade of deep purple that made her copper hair look like it was on fire. She looked every bit the woman in charge, because she was. This was her night. The Thornwall Conclave, the first diplomatic gathering held in 6 years, and she had organized every detail down to the napkin folds. As the newly appointed keeper of the hall, the youngest woman to ever hold the title, she had fought for this position with nothing but her own stubborn will and a mind sharp enough to outmaneuver every lord who thought a 23-year-old woman had no business running anything. She scanned the guest list again. Lords of the Northern Reaches, emissaries from the Southern Isles, merchant guild leaders, pack alphas from the borderlands. Every name accounted for. Every name except one, Darius Ashenford, Alpha King of the Dusklands. She'd crossed him out herself. Not because she had anything personal against the man. She'd never met him. But his reputation preceded him like a thunderclap before a storm, and the last thing she needed was a territorial alpha with a history of dismantling peace talks, walking into her carefully balanced evening and tipping the whole thing sideways. She'd sent the formal disinvitation 2 weeks ago. Polite, firm, final. The receiving line was moving smoothly. Amanda greeted each guest with the kind of precise courtesy that made people feel important, without making them feel comfortable enough to linger. She had a talent for it. A survival skill, really. When you grew up with nothing, you learned to manage people who had everything. Lord Draven of the Northern Reaches bowed stiffly over her hand. His silver coat was buttoned to the throat, and his eyes were the pale, watery blue of a man who had never been told no. Keeper Amanda. Quite the ambitious undertaking for someone so new to the role. She smiled, and it didn't reach her eyes. I find ambition pairs nicely with competence, Lord Draven. Please enjoy the evening. He moved on, and she allowed herself a single breath of satisfaction. Then the air in the room changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the way conversation softened. The way heads turned toward the main entrance not with curiosity, but with something closer to instinct. The way the candlelight seemed to pull toward the doorway as if even fire wanted to see what was coming. He walked in like he owned the stone beneath his boots. Darius Ashenford was taller than she'd expected. Broader, too. He wore a coat of deep charcoal, almost black, with silver threading that caught the candlelight along the shoulders and down the open collar where it revealed the hard line of his throat. His hair was dark, swept back from a face that was all sharp angles and restrained power, a jaw that could have been carved from the same stone as the keep. Eyes that were the color of winter smoke, pale gray with something burning beneath them, something that looked ancient and barely contained. He moved through the parting crowd with the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. 2 men flanked him, large and watchful, but they were unnecessary. Everything about Darius Ashenford said that he was the most dangerous thing in any room he entered. Amanda's fingers tightened on the guest ledger. Her heart was hammering, and she resented it. She did not get flustered. She did not get intimidated. She got prepared. He stopped directly in front of her podium. The crowd had gone so quiet she could hear the candle wax dripping. Those gray eyes found hers, and something in her chest pulled tight. Not fear. Something worse. Something that felt like recognition, which made no sense because she had never seen this man before in her life. You're not on the list. she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. One corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. Something far more dangerous. I received your letter. Then you know you're not welcome here tonight. I know what the letter said. He tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with heat. But I don't need an invitation. The silence in the hall was deafening. She could feel every set of eyes on them. Every lord and emissary and merchant holding their breath, waiting to see how the Keeper of Thornwall would handle the Alpha King showing up uninvited to her conclave. She could yield. It would be the safe choice. The expected choice. No one would blame a young woman for bowing to the most powerful alpha on the continent, but Amanda hadn't clawed her way to this position by being safe. She closed the guest ledger with a deliberate snap. In this hall, everyone needs an invitation, even kings. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or interest. The distinction didn't matter because what happened next changed everything. A crash from the far end of the hall. Shattered glass, then shouting. Amanda's head whipped toward the sound just as the first wave of chaos erupted. A group of armed figures in dark red surged through the service entrance, weapons drawn, faces covered. Not guests. Raiders. The kind of organized, ruthless raiders that had been terrorizing the border towns for months, the very reason she'd organized this conclave in the first place. Before she could move, Darius's hand closed around her arm. His grip was firm, but not painful, and the contact sent a jolt through her that she couldn't explain. Warmth. Electricity. A hum that settled somewhere behind her ribs like a tuning fork struck against her bones. "Get behind me," he said. Low. Commanding. She yanked her arm free. "This is my hall." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he moved, and she watched in stunned silence as the Alpha King intercepted the first raider with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for a man his size. He caught the attacker's wrist, twisted, and the weapon clattered to the marble floor. The whole thing took less than 2 seconds. The hall erupted. Guests screamed and scattered. Guards poured in from the corridors. And Amanda did what she'd always done in a crisis. She acted. She grabbed the ceremonial blade mounted on the wall behind her podium. It was decorative, but the edge was real, and she'd made sure of that when she'd taken this position. She moved through the chaos with purpose, directing guests toward the reinforced north corridor, shouting orders to the guards, positioning herself between the fleeing civilians and the attackers. A raider lunged for her. She sidestepped, slashed across his forearm, and he stumbled back with a snarl. When she looked up, Darius was watching her from across the room. He'd dispatched 3 of them already, and his charcoal coat was torn at the shoulder, but his expression wasn't anger. It was something raw and open and startled, like he was seeing something he hadn't expected. The skirmish lasted less than 10 minutes. The raiders were outnumbered once the full guard mobilized, and whatever they'd come for, they hadn't planned on the Alpha King being in attendance. The survivors fled back through the service tunnels. The hall was left in disarray, broken glass glittering across the marble like scattered diamonds, overturned tables, the acrid smell of smoke from a toppled candelabra that the servants quickly extinguished. Amanda stood in the middle of it all, chest heaving, the ceremonial blade still in her hand, copper hair tumbling loose from its pins. Her amethyst gown was torn at the hem, and there was dust on her cheek, but she was uninjured. She was alive. Her guests were alive. "You're bleeding," Darius said from behind her. She turned. He was close. Closer than she'd realized. She could see the silver threading in his coat in detail now, could see the way his chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, could see the thin cut along his own jaw where a blade had grazed him. His gray eyes dropped to her left hand, and she followed his gaze. A shallow cut across her palm. She hadn't even felt it. "It's nothing," she said. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. His fingers were warm as they cradled her hand, turning it to examine the cut. That hum again. That impossible resonance that vibrated through her chest and made her breath catch. "You fight like someone who's had to," he said quietly. "I fight like someone who refuses to stop." His eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment the entire ruined hall fell away. Just his hand around hers. Just that gray gaze holding her like an anchor. "I should not have come uninvited," he said, "but I am not sorry I was here." She should have had a sharp response for that. She always had sharp responses, but something about the way he was looking at her, like she was a language he'd been trying to learn his entire life, stole every clever word from her tongue. "You can stay," she said, "for tonight." The next several hours dissolved into the organized chaos of aftermath. Amanda worked alongside her staff, cataloging damage, checking on guests, coordinating with the guard captain about increased security. Through it all, Darius stayed. Not hovering, not taking over. He moved quietly through the work, helping where he was needed, speaking with the frightened emissaries in a voice that was low and steady and surprisingly reassuring. She found herself watching him. The way he crouched down to speak to a terrified servant girl, his voice gentle. The way he helped right a heavy table with one hand while keeping his attention on the guard captain's report. The way he moved through her space not like he owned it, but like he respected it. It was well past midnight when the hall was finally secured and the guests were settled in their quarters. Amanda found herself standing on the east balcony, the cold night air stinging her cheeks. The ceremonial blade cleaned and returned to its mount. Below her, Thornwall's garden stretched out silver and black under a heavy moon. She was exhausted down to her marrow, but her mind wouldn't quiet. "You should be resting." His voice came from the doorway behind her. She didn't turn. "So should you." Darius moved to stand beside her at the railing. He'd removed his torn coat and stood in a simple dark shirt, the sleeves pushed to his elbows, and she could see the lean, corded muscle of his forearms, the scars that spoke of years of fighting. He smelled like wood smoke and something colder. Pine, maybe. Winter air. "They'll come back," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. I organized this conclave to unite the territories against them, to build a coalition." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Instead, they used it as a target." "They used it as a target because it threatened them. That means it's working." She turned to look at him. In the moonlight, his features were softer, the harsh angles gentled by silver light, and those smoke-gray eyes were watching her with an openness that made her chest ache. "Why did you come tonight?" she asked. "The real reason." A long pause. The wind moved through the garden below, rustling dried leaves. "Because the woman who had the nerve to cross the Alpha King off her guest list was either foolish or fearless. I needed to know which." "And your verdict?" "Neither." His voice dropped lower. "You're something else entirely." That pull again, that golden thread of connection tightening in her chest, drawing her toward him like gravity had rearranged itself. She felt her heart rate change, felt the warmth spreading through her despite the cold air, felt her body lean almost imperceptibly toward his. "I don't know what this is," she whispered. "I think you do." She did. She'd read about it in the old texts, the resonance, the bond that some alphas shared with their destined partner, the one that hummed beneath the skin and rewrote every instinct. She'd always thought it was mythology, a pretty story to justify political alliances. She didn't think that anymore. "I'm not some fragile thing that needs protecting," she said, and it came out more vulnerable than defiant. "I know." He turned to face her fully. "You held a blade tonight and stood between danger and everyone in that hall. You don't need protecting, Amanda." The way he said her name, like it was something precious, something he wanted to hold carefully between his teeth. "But you deserve someone who would try anyway." She felt the tears before she could stop them. Not from sadness, from the sheer, overwhelming relief of being seen. She had spent her entire life being strong because no one had ever given her the option to be anything else. She had raised herself after her parents died when she was 11. She had worked as a kitchen girl in this very keep, scrubbing floors and dodging the hands of men who thought her poverty made her available. She had educated herself by candlelight, stolen hours with borrowed books, fought for every scrap of respect until she'd earned a position that no one could take from her. No one had ever looked at her and seen both the strength and the exhaustion of maintaining it. "I don't cry," she said, even as the tears fell. "I know," he said again, and then he reached out and brushed one away with his thumb. His touch was impossibly tender for hands that had broken a man's grip 2 hours ago. "You don't have to stop." She didn't stop. He didn't tell her it was okay. He didn't try to fix it. He simply stood there, solid and warm and present, while the keeper of Thornwall let herself be something other than unbreakable for the first time in 12 years. When the tears finally quieted, she became aware of how close they were standing. His hand had moved from her cheek to the side of her neck, his thumb resting against the pulse point beneath her jaw. She could feel her own heartbeat under his touch, quick and alive. "If I kiss you," she said, "it doesn't mean I'm agreeing to anything." That almost smile again. "Understood." She kissed him. His mouth was warm, and he kissed her back with a restraint that trembled at its edges. His hand tightened on her neck, not pulling her closer, just holding, and his other hand found her waist, fingers spreading across the velvet of her gown, like he needed to feel as much of her as possible. She tasted wood smoke and winter and something that felt like coming home, which terrified her, because she had never had a home. When they parted, his forehead dropped to hers. His breathing was unsteady. "Amanda, don't say anything romantic. I'll lose my nerve." A low sound that might have been a laugh. "I was going to say your hand is still bleeding." She looked down. He was right. The cut had reopened. He took her hand again, carefully, and this time she let him lead her inside. He cleaned the wound himself in the small apothecary room off the main corridor. She sat on the wooden table and watched him work, his large hands impossibly precise with the cloth and salve. The room was lit by a single oil lamp, and the warm light turned his dark hair almost bronze. "You're gentle," she said, surprised. "With you." He wrapped the bandage around her palm, securing it with a careful knot. "With you, I am." Those words settled into her like embers. The next 3 days collapsed into something Amanda had not planned for and could not have predicted. The conclave continued, but the attack had shifted everything. The territories that had been reluctant to cooperate were suddenly desperate for alliance, and Darius, the man she'd tried to keep out, became the linchpin that held the negotiations together. They worked side by side. She handled the logistics, the diplomacy, the delicate art of making proud lords feel heard without giving them too much power. He handled the military strategy, the territorial disputes, the moments when tempers flared and someone needed to remind the room that there was a common enemy at the gate. They were devastatingly effective together. And in the spaces between the work, they found each other. A conversation that ran past midnight in the library. A shared meal in the kitchen when neither could sleep. His hand finding the small of her back as they walked through corridors. A touch so natural it felt like they'd been doing it for years. Her leaning into him during a brief, stolen moment in the garden, her forehead against his chest, his chin resting on her hair. The bond between them deepened with every hour. She could feel it now, not just as a hum but as a current, a river of warmth and awareness that connected them even when they were in different rooms. She knew when he was frustrated. He knew when she was afraid. It was intimate in a way that went beyond anything physical, and it terrified her as much as it steadied her. On the third night, the raiders returned. They came in force this time. Not through the service tunnels but through the main gate, armed with siege weapons and dark intentions. Amanda had prepared. The coalition she'd built, the one forged in the ashes of that first attack, held firm. The territories fought together for the first time in a generation, but the raiders had a leader, and their leader wanted Amanda. His name was Voss, and he'd been the previous keeper of Thornwall, the man she'd replaced, the man who'd been dismissed for corruption and cruelty, and who had apparently spent the last 2 years building a private army to take back what he believed was his. He found her in the lower corridor during the fighting. She'd been directing the evacuation of the servant quarters when he stepped out of the shadows in his blood-red leather, a blade in each hand, his scarred face twisted with something that looked like pleasure. "Little kitchen girl," he said, playing at power. Amanda drew her blade, the ceremonial one, the one she'd sharpened herself. They fought. She was quicker. He was stronger. He drove her back through the corridor, each strike sending shockwaves up her arms, and she felt the old fear rising, the fear of the girl who'd scrubbed these floors, the fear of being small and powerless and at the mercy of men who wanted to use her. No. She found her footing. She found her center. She parried his next strike, ducked under his guard, and slashed across his weapon hand. His blade clattered to the stone, and she kicked it away. He staggered, snarling, reaching for his second weapon. A hand caught his wrist from behind. Darius. The Alpha King had appeared without sound, and the look on his face was something Amanda would never forget. Not rage. Something beyond rage. A cold, absolute fury that turned his gray eyes to ice and made the air in the corridor feel like it had dropped 20 degrees. "You will not touch her," Darius said. His voice was quiet. That was the terrifying part. "You will not look at her. You will not speak her name." Voss tried to wrench free. Darius's grip didn't shift by a fraction. "She doesn't need your protection," Voss spat. "She doesn't." Darius's eyes never left the man's face. "But I am choosing to stand beside her while she decides what happens to you, because that is what she deserves. A choice." Amanda's breath caught. Even now. Even in this moment of violence and danger, he was giving her the power. He was not rescuing her. He was backing her up. "Lock him in the lower cells," she said. Her voice was stone. "He'll stand trial when the conclave reconvenes." Darius released Voss into the waiting hands of the guards who had followed him down the corridor. Then he turned to her, and the ice in his eyes melted into something so warm, so desperately tender, that she almost broke right there. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and pulled her against his chest. She let him. She buried her face in his shirt and breathed him in, wood smoke and pine and the salt of exertion, and felt the bond between them singing. Not humming anymore. Singing. "I watched you fight him," he said into her hair, "and I have never been more afraid in my life." She pulled back enough to look up at him. "I had him." "I know you did." His hands framed her face, thumbs tracing her cheekbones. "That's what scared me. Not that you might lose, that you might always have to fight alone." "I'm not alone anymore," she said, and the words felt like a door opening. He kissed her. Not gently this time, with everything, with the fear and the relief and the bone-deep certainty that this was real, this was them, this was inevitable. She kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer, and the bond between them locked into place, with a sensation like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting centuries to open. When they finally broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, she said, "I love you, and I didn't plan for that." He laughed, a real laugh, low and warm. "I love you, Amanda. And I have been planning for you my entire life." 3 months later, the keep was different. The conclave had become a permanent council. The territories were cooperating. Trade routes were open. The raids had stopped after Voss's trial and imprisonment, his network dismantled by the very coalition he'd tried to destroy. Amanda stood on the east balcony, the same balcony where she'd cried in front of a stranger and kissed a king. Spring had come to Thornwall, and the gardens below were erupting with color. White blossoms and purple wisteria climbing the old stone walls, birdsong threading through the morning air, sunlight warm on her face, arms wrapped around her from behind. Darius pressed his lips to the curve of her neck, and she leaned back into him with the easy familiarity of someone who had learned, finally, that she didn't have to hold herself up alone. "The emissaries from the eastern provinces arrived today," she said. He tightened his arms. "Tell them I'm busy." "You're the Alpha King. You can't be busy." "I'm also your husband. I can be whatever you tell me to be." She laughed and turned in his arms. He was wearing a deep blue shirt today, the color of twilight, and it made his gray eyes look almost silver. There was no coat, no formality, just the man who had walked into her hall uninvited and stayed because she'd let him. She reached up and straightened his collar even though it didn't need straightening. "You know, I still have that guest ledger, the one with your name crossed out." "I know. You framed it." "I framed it because it's the last time anyone told you no." He caught her hand and kissed her knuckles, right over the faint scar on her palm. "You tell me no at least 3 times a day." "That's different. That's marriage." He smiled, and it reached his eyes, which was something she'd learned he only did with her. "I never did get a formal invitation." She laced her fingers through his. "You never needed one." The morning light spilled across them both, golden and warm, and the bond between them hummed its steady, unbreakable song. Somewhere below, the keep was waking up. Servants were lighting fires, guards were changing shifts. A world was continuing to rebuild itself, piece by careful piece. But here, on this balcony, there was only this. A woman who had learned she could be strong and held at the same time. A man who had learned that the most powerful thing he could do was stand beside someone, not in front of them. And a love that had walked in uninvited and refused to leave. Amanda closed her eyes and let herself be still. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to fight for the ground beneath her feet. It was already hers. All of it. The keep. The council. The king who looked at her like she was every answer he'd ever needed. And it had all started because she'd had the audacity to cross his name off a list.